Today, you can ship a package from Shanghai to your doorstep for $3.47. But that modern miracle only exists because on April 26, 1956, a converted oil tanker sailed from Newark to Houston, carrying 58 aluminum boxes, and the cost to move cargo dropped from $5.83 per ton to 16 cents. The system wasn't designed by engineers or corporate executives. It was invented by a truck driver from North Carolina who never graduated high school. The shipping industry called him a fool. The unions tried to destroy him. Then Vietnam started, and the US military realized they couldn't fight without him. His name was Malcom McLean, and in 1956, almost no one believed him. By 1953, Malcom McLean had built the fifth largest trucking company in America. He had 1,700 trucks moving freight up and down the East Coast. But he had a problem that was costing him a fortune. Every time his cargo reached a port, it disappeared into a black hole. He'd first seen the problem 16 years earlier, 1937, Hoboken, New Jersey. McLean had driven all night from Fayetteville, North Carolina, with a load of cotton bales. But when he arrived at the pier at dawn, he waited and waited. Longshoremen moved cargo piece by piece from ships to warehouses. Each crate was logged by hand. Each barrel was stacked manually. By the time they unloaded McLean's truck, the sun was setting. He'd wasted an entire day watching men move boxes. This wasn't unique to Hoboken. Every port in America operated the same way. Cargo arrived in wooden crates, canvas bags, steel drums, and burlap sacks. No two pieces were the same size or weight. Longshoremen had to unload each item individually, carry it to a warehouse, log it in a ledger, then reload it piece by piece into a ship's hold. A single ship could carry 200,000 separate items. Loading took a week. Unloading took another week. Ships spent more time sitting at docks than sailing across oceans. And the cost was staggering. In 1954, moving cargo cost $5.83 per ton. 37% of that cost was just paying men to move boxes on and off ships. But no one had any incentive to change. The longshoremen were paid by the hour, so slow loading meant more money. The unions controlled the docks and fought any automation. Ship owners were paid by the ton, so they didn't care how long it took. Organised crime ran the warehouses and skimmed cargo off the top. Up to 30% of goods simply vanished between truck and ship. Everyone was making money except the people shipping the goods. McLean looked at this system and saw something no one else did. The problem wasn't the ships, it wasn't the trucks, it wasn't even the cargo. The problem was that every time goods changed hands, they had to be touched. But what if they didn't? McLean's first idea was simple. Drive his tractor trailers onto a ship, unhook the trailer, drive the truck off, and sail the trailer to its destination. He bought 2 World War II oil tankers and built ramps. But the moment he tried it, he saw the problem. The trailers were massive. They took up enormous space, and while a trailer sat on a ship for 5 days, he couldn't use it to haul other cargo. He was paying for trailers to do nothing. Most people would have given up, but McLean wasn't most people. He wasn't an engineer. He wasn't a shipping executive. He was born in 1913 in Maxton, North Carolina, the son of a farmer. His family couldn't afford to send him to college. At 17, he bought a used truck for $120 and started hauling tobacco barrels. By 1940, he had 30 trucks. By 1953, he had 1,750. He was obsessively competitive. If you went hunting with him, he'd bet on who killed the first bird. He didn't accept that things had to be done a certain way just because they'd always been done that way. And he was about to bet everything he'd built on a metal box. So he changed the design. He hired an engineer named Keith Tantlinger, who had designed detachable containers in 1949. They would remove the wheels and chassis, just ship the box. McLean built the first containers out of aluminum, 35 feet long, 8 feet wide, but they were still incredibly heavy. An empty container weighed 8,000 pounds. When filled with cargo, the crane groaned lifting it. And that was just one container. He needed hundreds.
But then there was the problem of stacking them. If you just piled containers on top of each other, they would shift in rough seas. The ship would capsize. Tantlinger designed steel corner posts with holes drilled through them. A crane could hook into the holes from any angle. More importantly, the containers could lock together when stacked. But that only worked if every container had the same corner fittings. And in 1956, no one else was using McLean's design. Even if the containers worked, nothing else did. The ports had no cranes strong enough to lift 40,000 pounds. The ships had no framework to hold containers in place. The trucks had no chassis designed to carry detachable boxes. The railways had no flat cars that could secure containers. Every single piece of the supply chain had to be redesigned. McLean bought 2 massive cranes from a disused shipyard and sent them to Newark and Houston. He retrofitted his oil tankers with steel frameworks above the deck, where containers could be stacked and locked. He designed truck chassis with twist locks that could secure and release containers in seconds. He was building an entire system from scratch, and he was doing it with his own money. The shipping industry looked at McLean's system and did the math. Each container cost $1,500 to build. Each crane cost $500,000. Retrofitting a ship cost millions. And for what? To move cargo slightly faster? They pointed to the Army's experiment in the 1940s. The Army had tried containers and discovered they cost 10% more than traditional shipping. If you wanted to reuse the containers, they cost 70% more. The industry's conclusion was unanimous. Containers were a dead end. But McLean had seen something they hadn't. He'd done his own math. If he could load a ship in 8 hours instead of a week, the ship could make more trips. If he could eliminate theft and damage, he could save 30% of his cargo. If he could move cargo for 16 cents a ton instead of $5.83, he could undercut every competitor. The system would work. He just had to prove it. If the Ideal X failed, McLean would lose everything. He'd sold his trucking company for $6 million and borrowed millions more. His entire fortune was riding on 58 aluminum boxes and a converted oil tanker. April 26, 1956, Newark Harbor. 100 dignitaries gathered at the dock to watch. Shipping executives, port officials, bankers. Most came to see McLean fail. A crane operator climbed into position. He lowered the hook, locked it into the corner fittings of the first container, and lifted. The 8,000-pound box rose smoothly off the truck chassis. The crane swung it over the ship and lowered it into the steel framework. Click. Locked in place. The whole operation took 4 minutes. The crane operator moved to the next container. By the time the sun set, all 58 containers were loaded. 8 hours. The executives stood in silence. A traditional ship would have taken 3 days. McLean boarded a plane to Houston. He needed to be there when the Ideal X arrived. 5 days later, the ship came up the channel. McLean watched from the dock as the cranes unloaded the containers. 4 hours. He did the math in his head. 16 cents per ton. And then, this man who never showed emotion started to cry. But the shipping industry wasn't impressed. They called it a publicity stunt. It only works on short routes, they said. The containers are too expensive. The infrastructure doesn't exist. The longshoremen's unions were more direct. They went on strike. For the next 6 years, McLean fought them in court and on the docks. His system worked, but almost no one was willing to adopt it. McLean didn't wait for permission. He expanded his routes, Newark to Houston, New York to Puerto Rico. By 1960, his company, Sealand, was operating a small fleet of container ships. But it was still a niche business. The vast majority of cargo still moved the old way, piece by piece, crate by crate. McLean had built the future, but the world wasn't ready for it yet. Then came Vietnam. By 1965, the United States was pouring troops and supplies into Southeast Asia. But there was a problem. The ports couldn't handle the volume.
Saigon harbour was choked with ships. They sat at anchor for 2 weeks waiting to unload. When cargo finally reached the docks, it piled up in the tropical heat. Food rotted, medicine spoiled, ammunition sat exposed to monsoon rains. 30% of supplies never reached the soldiers who needed them. The US military was spending $2 billion a month on logistics. Half of it was wasted just moving boxes. Soldiers were running out of ammunition, while ships full of bullets sat offshore. The Pentagon was desperate. In early 1967, a Department of Defense official called Sealand. They'd heard about McLean's system. Could it work in a war zone? McLean said yes, but he had conditions. He needed full control. His ships, his containers, his cranes, his people. The military would pay a fixed rate per ton, and Sealand would handle everything. The Pentagon had no choice. They gave him a $70 million contract. Within months, Sealand transformed Cam Ranh Bay into a container port. They brought in prefabricated piers, massive gantry cranes, specialised trucks. The first container ship arrived in June 1967. It carried 600 containers, the equivalent of 10 conventional cargo ships. The military watched as Sealand's cranes unloaded all 600 containers in 24 hours. What used to take 2 weeks now took 1 day. The containers were loaded onto trucks and driven directly to army depots and air bases. No warehouses, no longshoremen, no theft. Soldiers received fresh food, medicine and ammunition within hours of the ship docking. By the end of 1967, Sealand was moving over 1,000 containers a month to Vietnam. The Pentagon realised they couldn't fight the war without McLean's system. The same system the shipping industry had called a publicity stunt was now the only thing keeping American soldiers supplied. By 1968, containerized shipping accounted for 40% of all non-fuel military cargo crossing the Pacific. 7 Sealand ships were doing the work of 20 traditional cargo vessels. The truck driver from North Carolina had become essential to the United States military, and the world was finally paying attention. After Vietnam, the shipping industry could no longer pretend containers were a publicity stunt. The Pentagon had just demonstrated that McLean's system could move more cargo in a day than traditional shipping could move in a month. Ports around the world began investing in container infrastructure. By 1970, Rotterdam, Hamburg and Tokyo were building massive container terminals. The International Organization for Standardization adopted McLean's 20-foot and 40-foot container sizes as the global standard. McLean made his patents royalty-free. He wanted the system to spread. The transformation was staggering. In 1980, containers moved 11 million tons of cargo worldwide. By 2022, that number reached 2.82 billion tons. Today, 90% of all manufactured goods travel in containers. The iPhone in your pocket, the shoes on your feet, the coffee in your cup, all of it crossed an ocean in a metal box McLean designed in 1956. Shipping costs dropped so dramatically that it became cheaper to manufacture goods on the other side of the world than in the next state. Factories moved to China, Japan, and South Korea. Supply chains stretched across continents. Walmart, Amazon, and the entire global economy became possible because a truck driver figured out how to eliminate the cost of touching cargo. McLean sold Sealand in 1969 for $530 million. He made $160 million personally. For a moment, he was one of the richest men in America. But he couldn't stop. In 1978, he bought United States Lines and built a fleet of massive container ships. He bet on rising oil prices. The prices fell. By 1986, United States Lines was bankrupt. McLean lost nearly everything. He took the failure personally. Thousands of workers lost their jobs, and he felt responsible. At 78, he started over again, founding Trailer Bridge, a new container shipping company. He never stopped innovating. He never stopped believing in the system he'd built. But by then, the world had moved on. Most people had no idea who he was.
Malcom McLean died on May 25, 2001, at the age of 87. Heart failure, New York City. The morning of his funeral, container ships around the world blew their whistles in his honor. But most Americans had never heard his name. The Secretary of Transportation called him a revolutionary. Forbes called him one of the few men who changed the world. But there are no statues of McLean, no monuments, just 10 million containers moving across the ocean at any given moment. In 2021, a single container ship blocked the Suez Canal for 6 days. Global trade ground to a halt. Billions of dollars in cargo sat waiting. The world suddenly remembered how dependent it had become on McLean's metal boxes. But even then, few people knew his name. That's the nature of the greatest innovations. They become invisible. You don't think about the container when you order something online. You don't think about McLean when your package arrives. But without him, that package would cost 50 times more and take 3 months to arrive. The modern world runs on a system so efficient we forgot it exists. Malcom McLean didn't invent the container. Others had tried before him. But he understood something they didn't. The problem wasn't moving cargo. The problem was touching it. And that simple insight changed everything.